is the Graceful Atheist Podcast, a part of the Atheist United Studios podcast network. Welcome to the Graceful Atheist Podcast. My name is David, and I am trying to be the Graceful Atheist. I want to thank my latest rater and reviewer on the Apple Podcast Store, SS. Thank you so much for leaving your review. Please consider rating and reviewing the podcast on the Apple Podcast Store, rate the podcast on Spotify, and subscribe to the podcast wherever you are listening. Thank you to all my supporters. If you too would like to have an ad-free experience of the podcast, please become a patron at patreon.com/gracefulatheist. Are you in the middle of doubt, deconstruction, the dark night of the soul? You do not have to do it alone. Please join our private Facebook group, Deconversion Anonymous, and become a part of the community. You can find us at facebook.com/groups/deconversion. We now have merch. If you'd like to have a Secular Grace themed, Graceful Atheist podcast themed t-shirt, mug, and various other items, Arlene has done the work to bring up a shop for us. The link will be in the show notes. Please check it out and get your merch today. Special thanks to Mike T for editing today's show. On to today's show. My guest today is Benoit Kim. Benoit is the host of the Discover More podcast. It focuses on independent thinking and mental health. Benoit himself is a forensic clinician in psychology, and he brings to bear his wide-ranging life experience, including being French-Canadian, having gained citizenship in the United States by serving in the Army. He was educated in and worked in policymaking for some time until he decided that that wasn't what he wanted to do with his life. He wanted to help people, and so he went into psychology. Benoit is a believer, but he has shed the fundamentalism. We get into how purity culture has affected his life. And finally, we touch on a subject that's important to Benoit and one that I need to be honest, I'm skeptical about, and that is the use of psychedelics in a clinical format. I want to be clear here that Benoit presents the evidence in a compelling way, but the difference between using psychedelics within a clinical environment with a trained psychiatrist is significantly different than doing so on one's own. I'll leave it at that. Here is Benoit Kim to tell his story. Benoit Kim, welcome to the Graceful Atheist Podcast.
David, thank you for having me on this rainy weather in Los Angeles, at least.
Yeah. So I'm up in the Pacific Northwest and I have sunshine. So we've traded weather.
Yes, we did.
Benoit, I'm going to let you talk about your own CV. There's a lot to it. If you could introduce yourself, tell people like what you're doing. I'll say up front that you're a podcast host of the Discover More podcast. We're going to get into some of the things where we are very similar, I think, and maybe some of the differences. But go ahead and introduce yourselves to the listeners.
So here's my 40,000 foot overview. So yeah, my name is French. I'm probably one of the few French Korean American you'll meet. And for the longest time on Facebook, for 10 plus years, I was the only Benoit Kim. So I spent the first half of my life in 4 different countries and 3 different continents. I was born in Paris, and then I moved to Korea, which is my ethnicity. And I lived in China for a while before I went to a boarding high school in California. And that was like the induction of my faith into this Lutheran high school. Okay. And I'm sure we'll get into it, where I think that was the first time I became allergic to these Lutheran indoctrinations of what they deem as graceful, what they deem as faith, what they deem as a good Christian, air quotes, versus the actual execution of that faith and this gracious lifestyle that I very much admire. And so now currently I work as a psychotherapist at USC. I accepted my new offer into the re-entry populations, working with justly populations who have mental illnesses. And I'll be working with them to hopefully to restore their sanity and for them to re-implement into the society. Because as we both know, recidivism is extremely high. At least in Los Angeles, is about 70%. And I'm a former policymaker. I went to graduate school at University of Pennsylvania, which is a #1 school at the program at the time. I went there and not to brag about the prestige of the school per se, since I worked a lot to shed that layer of the false self of this prestige. But it's more about the fact that I went there for the sake of making impact, because I believe in different vehicles for changes as a therapist, as a lawyer, as a physician, etc. But as a policymaker, you can impact thousands and thousands, because I held this utilitarian philosophy for the longest time. But through a lot of the dirty politics, compromising soul for the sake of impact, I took hopefully my third and last career pivot in the last 7 years into the clinical field 2.5 years ago. And my clinical interest is psychotherapy, in addition to psychedelic therapy, which speaks to my own healing journey, because psychedelics allow me to heal through my own sexual trauma if you have opportunity to go down to, because I'm very passionate about especially men's health and men's sexual health, which is not very often talked about.
Okay. Excellent. Wow. There's a lot to unpack, and hopefully we can get to. I'll just say immediately that on the podcast, a reoccurring theme has been the impact of purity culture, in particular on people as they deconstruct that affects them, even in the context of marriage, right? Even after, from a Christian perspective, sex is supposed to be a good thing, they can still find problems that follow them into marriage from that purity culture. So, as well as other people who have experienced sexual trauma events as well. Man, you've hinted a lot there. I want to focus just a little bit on the journey of faith for you. One of the questions we start with often is, what was your faith tradition growing up?
I appreciate you picking up what I'm putting down, which is an indication of a seasoned podcaster. But I have a lot to say because I feel like faith, first and foremost, ebbs and flows. Of course, spirituality ebbs and flows, which is a seasonality of life. However, as you talked about, purity culture is like this very big box. And I think it confines a lot of us who really upholds not just faith per practiced religion or practiced organized religion versus just believing this higher entity. I was born into Christianity. My parents my mom is a Catholic, devoted. I don't like denominations. I don't like the label because as the Bible talked about, religion isn't flawed, but man is. Therefore, religion becomes flawed, just like Jesus spent a lot of his effort trying to dismantle and fight the temple, so to speak. So I was born into that faith. However, I think a lot of people fail, air quote, to convert from their childhood faith to adulthood faith.
Okay.
Whether that's stress tested by life, reality tested by life, the grief and the loss, or as tragedies, which is inherent into life, right? Suffering is part of life, Christian faith aside. So I think that was my first taste into the perceived Christian faith versus the execution of Christian faith through the boarding high school I just alluded to. It's a Lutheran high school.
Okay.
I won't name the school, where they're a lot more conservative, a lot more orthodox, so to speak. And one thing that really, I think, catalyzed my whole conversations with myself and others about what does it mean to be a good Christian was I remember her name. Her name was Faith, very synchronistically.
Yeah.
And she was a senior and she experienced pregnancy in high school. And one thing that a lot of Christians, and especially Lutheran Orthodox branches, talk about is pro-life, pro-life, pro-life. And so through whatever conversations, Faith, she chose to keep the baby. But then I found out a few months later that she was expelled 2 months before graduation.
Wow. Okay.
And I think that was the first time I really contemplated about what does this mean that they're indoctrinating and they're preaching about all these biblical messages, all these truth and all these important things by this Messiah who was a perfect human and the perfect God that walked the earth. Yet in reality, they're expelling this 17-year-old who made probably one of the hardest decisions in her life to keep that baby per her faith. Yet the reward she gets is getting expelled 2 months before she's about to graduate, which obviously sparked a lot of other GED, other processes. And I was very much disheartened by that. But to answer your question, I think that was the first catalyst about this just faith conversation. And I think for the first time I realized it's bigger than just what people teach us on these schools.
I definitely think this is one of the similarities that we have is a focus on grace. I'm going to be on your podcast. I'll tell my story there, but just for context, I came to Christianity late in my teenage years, and I call myself a grace junkie. I was, having read the New Testament, I thought that, hey, this is what, and when I got to church for the first time, like for real, for the first time, I thought, hey, they seem to have missed this part of the message. They seem to have forgotten that he came for the poor and the sick and not the well and not the perfect and holy. So I think that's a deep similarity in our journeys here. Benoit, then I'd like to hear just a little bit more then as you get out of the boarding school and go on with the rest of your life. I understand you had a plan to do policy making and a few other things. You've also been in the Army. Tell me about some of those experiences.
Yeah, I tell a lot of people that I'm 30 now, but I feel like I lived a 10,000 lifetime in the last decade, which is a deep privilege because I'm alive here to tell the story. So, as an Asian American, I think I was part of that statistics where I was raised by a tiger mom. I was raised under this belief that achievement at all cost.
Mm.
Mental health isn't real. Doesn't matter. Just work hard, put your head down, and whatever will happen will succeed. So I had all these 3-year, 5-year, 7-year meticulous plan. I'm very cognitive, I'm very heady, and I like to front load and I like to organize everything. But ironically, contrary to my high school faith journey, I think through this, a lot of pain teachers, as I call them, I think God taught me to surrender, that this force of life that we call is this container of life is larger than we are. It's larger than our will, larger than what we think life should be versus what it actually is. But I joined the Army because that's how I became a naturalized citizenship. I became a reserve armyist after the um, combat training in the summer through this specialized language program because I'm multilingual. So it's like a linguist program based on warfare needs. And then through that, at the time, it was relatively peaceful. When I joined, it was 2015, I believe. So there wasn't a lot of things going on. We're coming from the post-Bush era, right? Things relatively calm during the Obama era as well. And then in 2017, I don't know if you remember, but Mr. Trump and Kim Jong-un at the time, they had excuse my French, dick measuring contest.
Yes.
I have a red button. No, I have a red button. No, mine's bigger, etc. So our unit was one of the 12 units to get summoned to get deployed to North and South Korean border. And I was 24 at the time. And that was the first time I had to confront my limited mortality, that holy crap, I may die, because it was perceived as extremely high tension and the tension was escalating for like months. So a lot of speculation about, is this World War III, etc. And I think that's when I really questioned my faith as well, because I was like, God, why have thou forsaken? That's a very common saying in the Bible and otherwise. And that's how I really felt. And that also catalyzed my first major depression. Like I said, because of my tiger mom, I didn't believe in mental health. Somehow, whatever I wanted to do, I will my power through, and I was able to achieve it. Sure, there's obstacles, there's the micro pains and sufferings and teachers, of course, but I've never experienced this dramatic shift of my internal landscape, going from this someone who feel like I could do most things to, holy crap, I don't have my life in control. I may die in the next 9 months, however the timeline is. But then we can talk more about, but through different ebbs and flows, I really realized that was God's way of instilling what surrender means. Because as you know, air quote, high achievers, people who are very heady, we have way of intellectualizing everything to our own benefits. And somehow I think God found ways to humble me more, because at the time I was more prone to hubris. I really thought I had it all. I could do whatever I'd set my mind to, especially through this faith. I'm God's child. I can do all things through him. But of course, it's over spiritualization.
And just being a 20 something man. But yes,
right.
I definitely remember thinking, yeah, I know it all. So. So definitely, I think one of the things that makes you interesting as a podcaster is having a couple of fairly dramatic life experiences that made you reevaluate the importance of life, the importance of mental health, the importance of being the self-aware of the self-achiever in you, and recognizes you needed a little self-grace. Talk to me a bit about how that you get from the hubris and the goal achievement oriented personality to a bit more humility and a bit more self-grace.
I wish the answer is more, it's rosier than what I'm about to share, but in actuality, just when you're faced by the tidal waves of life, you just humble. You learn to be humbled. The life humbles you, because I truly believe, whether you believe in synchronicity, spirituality, the source, oneness, God, whatever language you want to attach it as, that I believe it as God. I think God or life tries to teach you the same lesson. Until you learn that lesson, I think it hits you with the same lesson over and over again. So for about 3-4 years, I didn't truly become humble. Like the humility wasn't ingrained in my essence until the third, fourth year. And I realized, holy crap, God, I see what you're trying to teach me. And through that shift, I inevitably became more receptive to feedback, just to accept this truth that life is just unknowable. And I think C.S. Lewis, a famous Christian philosopher, he's like a mystic in a lot of people's. I mean, the guy is phenomenal. I think he talks about one of the fundamental characteristics of God is the unknowability. The moment you can know and grasp what God is, God loses its essence. And I think you can make that same statement about the universe and the source. And I think it's the unknowability that I really had difficulty with. Because why isn't pattern recognition useful? Because it allows you to feel a sense of delusions or illusions control about the future. But the past does not predict the future, period. So I think that's how I was able to go from this mid-20 kid who I got it all to learning about the hierarchy of ignorance. The more you know nothing. And so through that and just a lot of the tidal waves of life and through a lot of introspection, which is my personality trait, shout out to my parents, to how I would journal, I would meditate, and I'll really think about what just happened to me and sort of create a space in my life to review the archives of my behaviors and actions. And is what I'm doing serving me? Is it allowing me to show up the way I'm proud of, the way God is proud of, to my friends, to my partner, to my work, etc. But it was not this straightforward linear journey, because I think a lot of people have this illusion that life is linear. As you know, David, life isn't linear, neither is faith's journey. And I think I just accepted the non-linearity of life. And I think God played a big role the way I perceive it as. At the end of the day, humans are meaning-making machines. And I think that's the meaning I chose actively to equip my life with and the lane I walk. And that's why I'm very open with different type of conversations. I have a lot of atheist friends, because at the end of the day, you find the meaning that's fitting in your life, the container of life you walk in, and that can either serve you or it does not serve you.
Yeah, it's interesting. In just that answer, you've went over a number of things where we disagree, and the one that we do agree on is that people are meaning makers, and there's some. This is the other thing I think that's interesting about your story. I do think that each of us must come to a point where we recognize that fact, and there's no way to share that with someone else. I recently had Jennifer Michael Hecht. She's a beautiful writer. She's written a number of books, one called Doubt, one's called The Wonder Paradox. But we talked about that a lot, that almost every generation as a society and each individual has to go through this process, a bit of self-discovery, a bit of the humbling process, a bit of recognizing that we make meaning in this life and embracing that and moving forward. And maybe not everyone has that recognition and experiences that, but it's a very significant human experience.
Yeah, if I may, I think a lot of people forget this truth that self-discovery process that you alluded to requires a pause and an inflection point, so to speak. Like the pandemic, a lot of people call it the great pause.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, it's a lot of tragedies happen. A lot of people died. So I hate finding silver linings in such a tragedy. At the same time, our brains are about 3 million years old, give or take. So it's been optimized evolutionarily speaking. So it's like with emotions, there is no such thing as useless emotions. That's why I talk a lot about my clients. Anger, grief, sadness, they all serve a purpose. Just like happiness, excitement, and joy, they all serve a purpose. The positive, negative dichotomy of emotions is what we attribute them as, but they all serve a purpose. Likewise, our brains allowed us to create this autopilot mode, right? Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, Nobel Prize winning cognitive psychologist, he talks about system one thinking. It's been evolutionarily optimized so we can just go, go, go. It doesn't really require to think. But if you have to think about 12 times 15, you have to wait a minute, you have to pause and really think that. And I'm quite a meta thinker, so I want to tie that into the question or this discussion we have, where likewise, without these air quote sufferings that so many humans are allergic to, and we want to prevent suffering, which is pretty laughable because we didn't choose our birthright. We're only here, David, because our parents, grandparents made a certain decisions at a certain point in the timeline that allowed us to be born. So if we didn't even choose to be born, what gives us any rights to have this hubris, this belief that we can actually influence or exert power over life. And so to that point, I think, yes, self-discovery. And yes, I think through this self-discovery, many people go from converting childhood faith to adulthood faith, in my case, through a lot of ups and downs, or in your case, who choose to deconvert while still upholding this grace or gracefulness essence that I think is probably the reason why you're so open to talk to a lot of Christians and believers, because some people do have that. But I think it requires a pause. And I think that pause often comes with pain.
It's interesting you mentioned the pandemic. If you just go back through the back catalog, a huge number of guests will talk about that was the moment. They were out of the context and they began to question what they had been taught. So again, I'm positive on pauses. I want to return back to your personal story a bit because you I think got the entire education to do policymaking as an extension of what you were doing in the Army, I believe, and then subsequently decided that that wasn't the thing you wanted to do. So let's talk about that, like what that was like, and then what changed your mind.
That's another shining example about this surrender piece. I think God had me on for the last quite a few years. So I really believed in the avenue of policymaking, because I recognize the power of and the privilege of education, not just in my life, but also my parents' life as well. As immigrants, they only got to where they are because of the education they've been given. And self-discovery, curiosity, explorations, personal developments, those are all byproducts of privileges. If you don't have privileges, then you're surviving and you don't have the ability to seek out podcasts, grow yourself, these growth junkies as I am. So that's a privilege in itself. But so I got into policymaking, and you hear things, right? You're like, oh, a lot of people stray away from their intended path. They become part of the problem because that's the only way. But once again, the hubris in me is like, no, I'm different. I will be able to successfully overcome and conquer this monstrosity of policy, gridlocking system, unlike the millions came before me who failed. Even Obama, he talks about in his autobiography, The Promised Lands. So I thought, no, I could do it. And I got into policymaking, and being at Penn was a pretty conducive environment. And that's when I really realized the reason why air quote prestige is important is not the name value, but the environment that you're in. For the first time in my life, I was not the first in my class. Like high school was pretty effortless for me. Things came pretty easily for me, just cognitively speaking. But then when I was at Penn, I realized I was not the lowest coefficient, but I was either the average or everyone else was above me. But I think that was my growth mindset by Carol Dweck, where I wasn't deterred by that. I wasn't envious. I saw that as amazing. I was like, holy crap, I could be esoteric. I could have these philosophical or whatever conversations and people get it. It's like us playing podcasting, right? It's like tennis. You throw a ball, I catch it and I give it back. It's like a give and take process. So, and then extend that into policymaking, where at least at the NGO, non-governmental organization I worked as a policymaker, a lot of people are Penn graduates. So there is this understanding that you have this air quote cognitive ability, this CV to be here. But I think that's when this policymaking became tricky, because I realized a lot of people who are in that field came from a very privileged background, and they had a great grasp in theory, but not in the pragmatic implementations of what that means.
Right.
Because passing a policy is not the same thing as implementation of policy. It's a timeless gap that we still grapple with in 2023. And I saw some of that within the policymakers, air quote circle. But then the real difficulty for me was realized I am not different from anyone else came before me. I'm just the same. And it's also a systematic issue, because to implement any changes, you have to compromise. You have to make trade-offs. You have to make deals. And it's not about what I want. It's about what you have to do. Like David, if I ask you, if you can make a minor moral compromise, you're not killing anyone, you're not stealing anything, but you may lose a few hours of sleep. But in return, as a product of that, you can impact 4,000 marginalized folks. Would you do that? You'll probably say yes.
Yeah, no, and I understand that policymaking must be 1,000 of those kinds of compromises a day. So yes, I understand.
Yeah, so that's when I saw and I realized through iterations of that, if I have to make that compromise today, I'll be fine. But what about next week? What about a month? What about a year? Just like cigarettes and addictions, nobody started with a pack of cigarettes first time. You start with the first. Nobody started with 6 bottles of wine. You start with the first glass of wine. And I think I saw this iteration process, and I'm very good at systems thinking. So I had this ability to sort of zoom out from the moments and the momentum and this go, go, go mode. And I really had to think for myself that can I resist this force of policy for the sake of air quote utilitarian impact? And I realized I don't want to sacrifice my soul. I don't want to sacrifice my essence of who I am, the integrity and the moral compass outside of religion that I uphold dearly through to my conditioning and my upholding. Because not all conditioning is bad. You can keep some conditioning and deprogram some that's not serving you. And that was when I turned 28 about 2.5 years ago to really sit with that. And I chose to depart from policy. But I was fortunately able to create a policy and truancy aspect in Philadelphia. And that was really cool working with the Black and Brown youth. So I still uphold a lot of gratitude and I still smile when I think about some of those experiences. But it is so difficult beyond what people even imagine. And the complexity is infinite.
Yeah, in particular, just the systems inertia and you're one person trying to move a mountain. Yeah, I can really appreciate that. You went on to want to focus on psychology, psychotherapy. Tell me why. What was it about that intrigued you?
There are a lot of contributing factors. And also to preface, I wasn't a congressman. Sure, I spent a few years in policy, but it was mainly the city level. I worked with some state folks for grants and funding sake, but I do want to preface by saying that I'm still very limited by the experiences. I'm just speaking about my own experiences. So please don't come and find me after the fact. But I think there's a lot of contributing factors to policy issues, socioeconomic, political, whatever language you want to add on to it. But from my experience, at least in Philadelphia, which is the poorest major cities, they contend with Chicago back and forth. They have one of the highest crime rates, and they have the highest illiteracy rate in all of major cities. So through that container and experiences, I realized a lot of the political issues and the societal issues I was deeply passionate about were simply the byproduct of lack of mental health, intergenerational trauma, like the trauma genes, the epigenetics, like people who go through a lot of hardships, like in the Black communities, that trauma gets encoded epigenetically, which is a change of DNA expressions. Genetics is the DNA genomes. And I saw that in the poverty, but often it's the combinations of many of those factors. And I think mental health and emotional health became the through line that I saw a lot of the political issues I was working with, at least in the city of Philadelphia. So I realized, wow, I think myself included, and many folks forget that the macro is comprised of the micro. And that's why you have to address the individual trauma component because hurt people, period. So I think I had to decide, do I want to stay in the macro realm or do I want to go to micro, which is individual work? And there's so many opportunities and there's so many directions you can take. But through my interest in psychology, emotionality, because I think how we behave, our behaviors are often the manifestations of how we feel internally, because internal reality gets manifested externally, right? So because of that, I did a lot of research and I chose the social work, which is a discipline I choose. But whether it's LMFT, PsyDs, whatever, you all do psychotherapy. It's just different approaches and different modalities.
If you're willing, I said I wasn't going to push you in this direction, but I'm going to. If you're willing, how did therapy or psychotherapy apply to you personally? And was that a part of the decision to go down that road?
I think it's twofold. So as I alluded to earlier, my first experience and my first taste of mental health was during my major depressions, catalyzed by my deployment, this looming deployment of potential life and death, which is a lot for a 20-some-year-old to bear because there is not a lot of opportunities in life to confront your mortality unless you have like near-death experiences, car accidents, etc. So that was the first, right? So I was recommended in the army to see a counselor. I only saw her once because I was very apprehensive. I was a skeptic. I didn't believe in mental health.
Right. Right.
Uh, but I did experience this utter consuming darkness. A imagery I can think about and I share on my podcast sometimes is like the bottomless pit in Dark Knight Rises 3,
Okay.
where Wayne was stuck in this bottomless pit and no one ever escaped before him. But with his thick plot armor, he was the first human to escape. And now, of course, he became this hero's journey, became this Batman, this triumph, etc.
Right.
I wasn't Batman. I didn't have his I didn't have his physical paralysis or his money or the plot armor. So I felt stuck in that bottomless pit. And this feeling of stuckness is what a lot of people attribute depression feeling like, if it's major depression. So that was one. But I think the real change with psychotherapy and the potential of it and why I became to believe it. So I went from a skeptic to a believer even after my major depression, because change takes time, period. Especially such a dramatic shift of internal psyche from not believing to believing, or believing to not believing in your case, requires a lot of processes. Was my sexual trauma, where I feel comfortable sharing because I was healed through that, through the power of psilocybin therapy, which is magic mushrooms. And
Okay.
I'm very well versed in psychedelic research. So I'm a both practitioner and I'm also a researcher and also consumer of research.
Okay.
Was in college, I had a sexual trauma with this individual. And without the gory details, it really contributed to my incessant like hookup culture. I became very vindictive because I didn't always want to save my virginity for my wife, because who knows, life is very long.
Mm-hmm.
But I wanted to at least save it for the special someone. And this person wasn't the special someone.
Got it. Okay.
And yeah, I was roofied and I woke up on the other side with the trauma. So because of that, I spent majority of my early 20s and mid 20s just it wasn't that I didn't want to commit. Sure, the commitment issues colloquially, I couldn't commit, because most people with commitment issues, it comes down to this feeling of lack of safety in relationships. Why? Trauma. So that's how I was. I was in superficial relationships, couple months at a time, couple weeks at a time, never wanted to commit because of the fear of being hurt again. And into 2017, when I came across this healer who facilitated me through this psilocybin therapy. Of course, it is still illegal on a federal level, but there's some exciting research and we're making some significant headways under this air quote psychedelic renaissance we're in.
Mm-hmm.
And within 8 hours, David. So remember, I spent 6 years harboring resentment, anger, rage towards this individual. And that extended towards all female and all women, just internally, because of that's traumatic response. Into within 7 to 8 hours, I had this thought after the guided psychedelic therapy where I literally thought to myself, I was like, I wonder how she's doing. Should I reach out and message her saying that I forgive her? Not forgiving her act, but forgiving her by giving myself the permission to move on with my life. I think that's why forgiveness is hard, because you feel stuck. I never reached out. It was too much work. I forgot her last name, so I never did that. But going from this dramatic shift of unable to, Erica, move on with my life relationally, to this place of forgiveness and grace by forgiving her, and I forgive myself. And through that, I was able to recommit to relationships, re-accept this fact that you may get hurt again, but if you don't try, that's the biggest regret. Because I tend to live my life minimizing regrets. I don't really believe in optimal decisions because there's constant opportunity costs. Being here, we're not outside. Well, it's raining outside for me, but it's sunny for outside.
Yeah.
Until recently, 6 months ago, I'm happily engaged to my fiance after 3.5 years.
Oh, congratulations.
And thank you. And that to me is what healing is, where it allows me to recommit and have faith in relational container that we call romantic relationship once more, into now being happily engaged with my future lifelong partner. So it's been quite a journey with mental health and psychotherapy, to say the least.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, so let's chat briefly about the psychedelics side of things. And I want to preface it by saying everything we do at this podcast is about gathering evidence. And I understand there's some fairly compelling evidence that I'll give you in a moment to discuss, that psychedelics within a clinical environment is quite effective for, in particular, things like PTSD and other traumatic events like such as yourself. I think the thing that I caution is and not you, but other people, other people I think are a bit too cavalier, because what is kind of wink, wink, nudge, nudge under the hood is, yeah, you can go, take LSD or magic mushrooms on your own and have this experience on your own. So there's a vast gap between doing something on your own versus in a clinical environment with trained people who can walk you through ultimately the experiencing of that trauma and the letting go of that trauma. So a couple of things I'd like you to address. One, let's talk about the research for a second from your perspective. And then do you share my my hesitancy to blanket recommend psychedelics?
100%. I think we live in this era of, I call it air quote motivation porn, endless, incessant motivations, inspirations, all these advices that's out of context. I don't give advices anymore because you have to contextualize everything and you have to ask, what is the context? So yes. And a reference point that just came to my mind as you were sharing is alcohol. So I've been sober from alcohol for about 3 years because it became a point of disservice in my relationship, actually. So I've been sober from that since. I
Congrats
share
for that too.
yeah, because I have nothing against alcohol. It played a role in my life. I don't have bad or good in my paradigm of vocabulary. I just, does it serve you or does it not serve you? I bring that up because alcohol is the only drug, because it's a poison chemically, that in America, if you tell people you don't drink, people ask you, why not? Not even a
Yeah.
drink. Why don't you moderate? Well, why? You tell them you don't smoke weed or you don't smoke cigarettes. Oh, good for you, man.
Yeah.
Great
Yeah.
for you. So I want to start with that. But I'm bringing this up because, like I said, I have the opportunity to spend my first half of my life in Europe and Asia. And alcohol is a lot more, not just more normative, but people start drinking at an earlier age.
Mm-hmm.
But if you look at the incidence of blackout, drunk driving, all these tragedies associated with drinking is significantly less than America. And I think it comes down to not the substance, but the utilizations and education around it. Like in Europe and Asia, most family and households will introduce you to alcohol in a more subtle, incremental stage. You have a sip of wine, you have a couple of beer with your family, especially with your dad, which is a lot of containers I'm familiar with. And then over time, based on the educations and this in a controlled setting of in home, you get to gradually increase your tolerance or your exposure or your alcohol intake. And you do that across societally, right? Whereas in America, we don't have that.
Yeah.
People get fake IDs, people binge drink, people go crazy when they're turned 21, public drunkenness. I was one of those. I had a public drunkenness on my record for a while until it was expunged a long time ago. So that's one thing I wanted to share. But yeah, I do agree that it has to be approached very, very cautiously because there are some red tapes. And then I'm sure we'll segue into the research aspect and the clinical implications and why it's so efficacious as a molecule, as a healing modality, is if you have heart disease, if you have mental illness in your family, and mental illness and mental health are different. Mental health is the overarching umbrella, and then mental illness is within that umbrella, just like physical health is not cancer, but cancer falls into the umbrella of physical health likewise. So if you have schizo, bipolar disorder, borderline personality disorder, etc., in your family, because the research shows about 20 to 30% of mental illness is genetics. What that means is 20 and 30% of people with family mental illness history, that gene stays dormant until it gets triggered by stress. Stress is the number one trigger that activates all mental illnesses. And once mental illness is activated, it's irreversible. That means you have that for the rest of your life, right? So if you have any of mental illness history in your family, it has to stay away because psychedelics has been documented to trigger psychosis or a psychotic episode. So that's one. And two, heart disease. People with heart issues or heart disease in your family, you also have to stay away because it's not conducive. And so there are red tapes, and it has to be consulted with medical doctors. I'm not a medical doctor. This is not medical advice, but you have to seek, you have to safeguard against potential implication because you can have too many ibuprofen and it will have adverse effects,
Mhm.
But ibuprofen, when taken appropriately, it has almost virtually zero side effects. It's extremely safe, right? But if you take in too many, it could cause some serious heart issues and
Right.
etc. Heart failures. Likewise, with psychedelics, it's the same thing. When you approach it safely through educations, through research, and I don't mean just Google browsing or
Yeah.
asking ChatGPT about tell me everything about. I don't mean that, but I mean actual research and actual consultation with professionals. It can have some amazing, amazing efficacies, and I'm sure we can talk more about.
Again, I don't want to get into my story too much, but just context, a lot of drug and alcohol addiction in my family. My rebellion was like, I'm not going to drink. So I'm actually, sober by choice and have been since 16. And I completely relate to you. Like when I tell people that, they think, oh, is it religious? And it's like, no. So it is, you are the odd person out. I've had to work out the social graces of, occasionally buying around for people just to be, be a part of the group. I enjoy being with friends, even if they are drinking, that's fine. I don't hold it against people, but it was definitely not something for me. The other aspect of growing up around drug and alcohol is, I've talked to people on psychedelics. I've talked to people on various other drugs. And one of the things I joke about is I've never come away from one of those conversations thinking, wow, that was really deep. And I just want to contrast that with what might happen in a clinical scenario where someone is guiding you through the experience. And so I'm definitely open to the research and the data that suggests that can be a positive experience. And the last thing I'll say is, for myself, I've got also a bunch of mental health issues, including several of the things that you mentioned. So my father, I believe, had schizophrenia. My mother, I believe she had personality disorder of one kind or another, undiagnosed. And so for me personally, it would never be an option. So just to have that out. So again, let's give you a chance to talk about some of the research here as well.
Thanks for sharing. I appreciate you sharing. Some of those disorders and personalities that we talked about are some of the most stigmatized in
Mm-hmm.
America due to
Mm-hmm.
Hollywood portrayal. Big surprise, what you're saying, Hollywood does not portray these realistically.
Mm-hmm.
So I appreciate you sharing that nonetheless. So also I want to press by saying that most of my research is from with John Hopkins, MAPS. These are not the research I conducted, but I'm consuming, and these are the sources I usually go to. And of course, Rick Dublin, the founder and the executive director at MAPS, which is a psychedelic research center under the Johns Hopkins Hospital, is extremely credible resource, and they are the pioneer and a leading effort in the psychedelic healing center or in the psychedelic healing effort or realm. So they just completed their third clinical trial, sponsored and funded by FDA. So it's extremely credible. Even our old outdated government agency department like FDA has recognized because the documented evidence is too compelling, as you said earlier. So their third trial finished, so the data is coming out. So I'll be speaking mainly about the second clinical trial that was completed about a year ago, give or take. So the data is out there, and also I'm very well versed in most meta-analyses. Meta-analysis just means it's extremely credible, has a lot of authority, and it's cross-references multiple different sort of clinical settings and data points. So it's like a consolidations of most researches, just for educational sake. So I want to start somewhere with numbers because I think numbers stick. It's a very simple number. Is effect size. So effect size is if you've taken statistics or whatever, effect size is like generally speaking, how effective the dosage or the study substance is. So more common substances that people are aware of is SSRI or SSDIs, which is antidepressants. It's very common. It works for some, does not work for many. The effect size of SSRI or antidepressants is about 0.3, which means it's minor
Right.
effectiveness. Because study shows that about 30 minutes to an hour of rigorous running or workout produces the same amount of serotonin as SSRI. Serotonin is the happy molecule, as we colloquially say it as, right? So as you can tell, it works, but definitely not for all. And then about MCT, magnetic conversion therapy, is one of the most effective treatment for depressions. like treatment-resistant depressions, or EMDR, is about 0.8, which means it's very, very great, moderate to very strong evidence. Psychedelic therapy, David, is 1.2 effect size.
Wow. Yeah.
Which is 4 times the effectiveness of SSRIs and about a third more significant and more efficacious than MCT or other some of the more very strong evidence-based therapy like CBT and so on. So that's the effect size. I want to start there. And the study I'm about to quote is the second clinical trial with Johns Hopkins, the FDA approved. They recruited, I think, 110 participants after parsing, after vetting, after eligibility, like the health cautionary that we just talked about. And these are the people with complex PTSD, treatment-resistant depression. What that means is these people have been on medications like SSRIs. They have been seeking psychotherapy for a decade, 10 years. So these are not skeptics. These are full believers of mental health, but they continue to battle with ongoing complications and suffering by their symptoms, despite being treated for them. So these are the criteria. So the eligibility, the bar is extremely high to even enter this realm of control study clinically. And not to turn this into a neurobiology lecture, so I'll share some of the high bullet points where it's a 2-year longitudinal study. Because like ketamine, which is considered as like the special K, like the entry drug for psychedelics, it does not give you this crazy hallucination effect. It's very mild. You just feel this deep relaxations. Just for people who are listening to this for the first time, it's the only approved psychedelic substance for clinical usage.
Okay.
But it's over applied. What I mean by that is it works, but according to meta-analyses and the most cutting edge research, the sustained efficacy for ketamine is about 1 to 2 weeks. What that means is it does improve your emotional well-being, it does decrease your symptoms, etc. But after about 1 or 2 weeks, it diminishes and you have to reapply. And at least in LA, ketamine is about $280 an hour. So it's extremely expensive. The entry point is very high economically. So it's not sustainable for many people. And so for psychedelic, I'm alluding to psilocybin, MDMA, which are the main molecules for PTSD or some of the symptoms we talked about or the diagnosis we talked about. It has at least 2 years of sustained efficacy. So 2 years after completion of this study, 86% of the participants that are alluded to, they no longer exhibited any symptoms that eligible them for have this diagnosis. In other words, 86% of these participants who've been medicated for 10 plus years, who've been seeking therapy for 10 plus years, no longer have any depressive or PTSD symptoms that when they got retested for diagnosing sake, like diagnostic assessment, they didn't even qualify for PTSD or depression. And I'm not talking about symptom reduction here. I'm talking about a complete eradication of the root disease itself. And until now, EMDR is a very, very great trauma modality, but psychedelic therapy is the only known modality that has the ability to have this effect size with this ability to eradicate some of these symptoms that have plagued so many people.
Okay. All right. Well, I think you've done an excellent job of presenting the evidence. I will let the audience, take that as it is and with a grain of salt and do some research on their own as well. I do want to talk a bit about some of our similarities and differences. One of the things that I think, so we already talked about grace. We've talked about we don't neither of us drink. The other thing I thought was just really interesting is we both did AmeriCorps. I'm curious what although I never was in the military, I'm huge into national service. I think that the civic engagement of Americans is so low. I'm a big believer in AmeriCorps. I'm curious what your experience was, and maybe I'll share briefly what mine was as well.
That's awesome. I don't think I've ever heard you. I did some research for your upcoming episode next week, but I don't think I came across that information. So I was a part of Teach for America, okay, which is part of the sub branches under AmeriCorps. I think there was like so many categories within AmeriCorps itself because it's a
sure, yeah.
So mine was a state AmeriCorps program under Teach for America, and so that was the entry point for me to go to nonprofit, which I didn't mention earlier. Like I said, I feel like I lived so many lifetimes. I forget some of the experiences I've had. especially under the current busy chapters in life that I'm currently in. But so that was my entry points to Philadelphia. That's how I actually got there. And another thing I didn't share, it's not on my CV, is I used to be in private sector because I studied economics and international relations in undergraduate. And so I got into management consulting, but I left that rat race very soon. So it's not even on my CV. I often forget I was in the private sector for a very, very brief blip of my life. And so I knew I needed to get into nonprofit because prestige does not transfer. And what's considered prestigious in one field, the other field has complete disregard, of course, because it's very contextualized. So I did all my research and I realized what's a consistent thread. I sort of alluded to this earlier that allow me to be where I'm at in life, education. So that's the focus. That's the focal point I wanted to approach and tackle. And I did a lot of research and I realized Teach for America is one of the accelerator programs. It pays for a lot of your certificates and it has a great reputation. It's like Michelle Obama used to talk a lot about it during her first lady days. So, brand effect. Oh, Michelle Obama, cool. This must be legit. So I applied, I got into, and then I taught in inner city, Philadelphia. I taught middle school. I taught sixth, seventh, and eighth graders.
Wow.
And it was called Harambe Institute of Science and Technology, not the gorilla Harambe, but Harambe in Swahili means brotherhood. So it was the first Afrocentric charter school in all of Pennsylvania. What that means is it's all Africans and not just African Americans, but there are some Africans. We actually speak Swahili in school. We have all these principles that we practice, like morning circles, the afternoon rituals for brotherhood, sisterhood, etc. So that was my experience. And to be honest, as a veteran, as someone who had some profoundly challenging experiences in my life, to say the least, because I've also had like 3 near-death experiences in the last like 7 years.
Mm.
When I look back to my teaching time, teaching these kids who come from the most horrendous family backgrounds, addictions, domestic violence, sexual abuse, death, drive-by shootings, the list goes on, almost on a daily basis. It's that rough of a neighborhood they come from.
Yeah.
I thought I was going to become this teacher with this accolades, this fancy CV, going to teach them about the subjects I was teaching. Very stereotypically, I was teaching math and social studies. So I'm just going to embrace my stereotype. But the little that I know, in actuality, the expectation was me, the subject expert, teaching these kids who lack the opportunities. In reality, I learned more about life and grit, humility, grace from these 128 kids that I taught. I think, sure, I taught them some linear equations, graph. Sure, I taught them a couple of subjects that I don't even know what purpose it serves in life anymore. But some of the lessons I learned from them and just this ability to show up despite these horrific challenges over and over again and still show up to school as good friends, as whatever. And I was like, wow, I will never forget some of the moments I shared. And I get emotional thinking about this because like they represent such this anti-fragility because there's resilience and there's anti-fragility, which means the rebounds, like you get back to even stronger threshold than where you started. And just this grace they display day to day for how much hardships they go through. And you can never tell some of this reality they live under until they ask you or until they tell you. And yeah, I realized, oh, we don't always have to wear our pain and trauma on the sleeves, which is not to go off the rail, but I feel like we're in this interesting culture where it oscillated too hard. 10 years ago, nobody ever talked about emotions. Mm-hmm. Now that's all they ever talk about. And emotions are important, but that's not all. Like you have to confront your trauma. You have to do the work. And I think these kids who didn't know mental health from Black and Brown communities who have the most significant hardships that even now, when I think about, but they're just so gracious, so understanding, so forgiving, so loving. So some of the pillars I've learned I still carry today, but I attribute a lot of my gratitude and just this profound just thankfulness towards my AmeriCorps Teach for America experience.
Excellent. again, I won't go into too much depth, but I was working not in an inner city, but a small size city with the probation department. So kids that had either been in juvenile hall for some time and were on probation, or were in probation schools. Basically, after kind of continuation schools, you get to a little more intensity in a probation school. And saw everything from heroin addiction to parents on meth and kids just trying to make it work. So same thing. Like these were just amazing individuals that were surviving incredible odds. And I related a lot to it because, again, grew up with drug and alcohol in my family. And it was definitely a life defining job, if you will, for 2 years of my life. So I'm a huge proponent of AmeriCorps, regardless of where you serve. Peace Corps, the same thing. Just again, back to having a sense of civic obligation, something like to give back, right? And I really, part of your story that I love is the naturalization through military service, participating in AmeriCorps, and clearly you're also giving back. And I think that should be tied into university education, right? Like pay for some of the or all of the your university education, and then you serve for a couple of years in one capacity or another. I think just a no brainer for helping America to heal a bit.
Could I ask you a question?
Please, yes.
So when I think back to some of my white peers in the Teach for America program, a lot of them had this not barrier, but this limited belief that their skin tone or their ethnicity will not allow them to build rapport and build relationships with some of these students they serve. At least in Philadelphia, even outside of my school, it's predominantly Black and brown. Now, I don't know the predominant population you work with or you serve, but do you feel like your personal lived experiences transcended your skin tone, your zip code, where you came from, that allows you to sort of really work and build relationship with some of the youth that you were working with?
Yes. And I think we could go into really deep waters regarding race, because I'm mixed as well. So my dad's side is Spanish and Mexican with Native American in it, and my mom's side is just very Caucasian. But I actually remembered a new word recently, mestizos, which is the mixed, from Mexico's embracing of the Spanish heritage people within Mexico. And that's it, right? That's me. So I'm obviously very white passing, and I'm culturally Caucasian as all get out. And so I've always had this weird experience of observing racism around me and not being the subject of that racism. But to answer the heart of your question, absolutely. In particular, the experience of being a child of an alcoholic and a drug addict was 1-to-1, right? Like that applied directly. And as a general rule, could try to get through to kids. At the same time, like myself, I think they were also very guarded and protective, and that didn't always work. But no, I didn't see that as a particular barrier. The population was white, Hispanic, very small Asian community as well. So,
yeah, I don't usually do leading questions, but I sort of can gauge what the answer could be, because I think that's a pretty ubiquitous across these AmeriCorps programs where the lived experiences transcends these other perceived barriers. But yeah, just to tie that into podcasting, I think that's why I love the art of long form podcasting, because stories outlive all of us. And I think it's a deep, profound privilege that we have the opportunity to hold space and have these platforms. At least for me, started as a passion project, now it's a business, to uphold these stories. And I think people underestimate with this TikTok cultures, everything's 15 seconds or less, highly scripted, highly rehearsed. I think people forget the power of stories, because like stories are not just content. Stories are reflections of these lived visceral experiences that become embedded genetically into our minds, and that we found them as very viscerally powerful, that we feel called to share these stories to other people. But I think you can go beyond podcasting, AmeriCorps, whatever other containers. But from my experience, my limited 30 years experiences, I think storytelling stays continuous as this timeless avenue to really connect people away from their skin color, race, zip codes, your socioeconomic statuses. And that's why I think stories are so powerful, because To my knowledge, Homo sapiens or humans are the only species that have the ability to retell our lived experiences to others.
And I think some of what I think we're both doing, but this podcast in particular is letting people tell their stories. And many of my guests, I didn't have that experience. I had a different experience. And it is the diversity, it's the literal diversity of the stories that someone else is out there going, wow, Jenny is telling my story. Bob is telling my story. Like I think we sometimes don't know what we don't know because we haven't experienced that. And listening to other people's stories, we get a peek into other people's experience.
Yeah, I try to create connection with mental health every opportunity I get,
Mm-hmm.
professional hazard. But to tie that into mental health, David, there's a lot of contributing factors to why psychotherapy works. But I think the essence of all mental health is this feeling that you are not alone, that you have
Yeah.
this profound realizations that you're not walking this path of life by yourself. Because this perceived solitude or perceived loneliness is in a lot of senses contributes to depression, feeling depressed. And I can't even tell you how many men, clients of mine, who tell me, oh, you're just gonna talk about feelings. You're not gonna change me. You're not gonna fix me. You're right. I'm not here to fix you. I'm just a navigation system, an avenue of explorations for your thought content, your emotionality, etc. But just by creating space to hold these experiences in a clinical container, or like you on this podcast, because secrecy, there's a lot of stigma around your guests and the people you try to create spaces for, which is the reason why I reached out in September last year, that you're gracious enough to respond recently for us to connect here officially. But people underestimate, and I cannot emphasize this enough, that I want to put this in a messaging board where just feeling heard, feeling seen, those two things alone can dramatically improve your emotional well-being and mental health. And because none of us live on an island, even if you live on an actual island, there's villages, there's tribes.
Mm.
And I really, really believe that healing and grounding takes a village. And if more of us can get our stories out there, even in this realm of stories overload, content overload, just it's not even about getting your stories heard by others, more about knowing that your stories are being seen and there are other people walking similar path with different contexts. But pain is ubiquitous. Doesn't matter who you are.
Benoit, I want to give you a chance to talk about the Discover More podcast. Maybe tell us the story leading up to starting it. What are you trying to accomplish there?
That's a vast question. I'm still figuring that out
Okay.
in my year 3.5. But the genesis of it was very simple, pun intended with the Bible. But so in early 2019, I saw the early rise of podcasting through Joe Rogan, Tim Ferriss, some of the greats that are doing amazing podcasting for the right reasons, I believe. I've always felt this loneliness, segueing into what I just talked about, this perceived loneliness.
Mhm.
Ever since I can remember, I read The Secret when I was 13. I've always been a ferocious reader. And I realized I don't just love one thing. I love a lot of different things. I love human psychology. I love politics. I love physics. I love all these economics. But I always felt this loneliness where I feel like a lot of people couldn't relate to my esoteric or wide ranging interest. So if I try to have these conversations, I could tell people tune out, or they're not as engaged, or they're very straight up disinterested at times. So I thought, oh, am I weird? And of course, there's jack of all trades, master of none. I disagree. I think you could be jack of all trades and master of some. I don't think it's mutually exclusive. But yeah, I thought I must be the weird one. I overthink, I have all these interests, and nobody can relate until podcasting, where through podcasting, I realized, holy crap, there is these people that are 4,000 miles away from me or right in the vicinity of my city or America who have the exact same interest, who are actively holding spaces to have these immersively engaging conversations with other amazing people, like high caliber aside, just people from academic backgrounds, professors, psychologists, business owners, athletes. And I was like, wow, I'm not alone. And I'm not the weird one after all. Maybe I just represent a smaller subset of populations cognitively. So that's one. But yeah, I started this just to capture some of these public conversations. Like every single one of us
Mhm.
have had those air quote profound conversations, 2 in the morning, maybe over a sip of wine or
Love
too many
it.
sips of wine. But how often do we remember those conversations? I didn't. So I had a co-founder who we later departed about a year ago to creative differences. But yeah, he was somewhere just similar. We met in the gym 5 in the morning and we could just talk about almost everything under the moon. It was almost like a podcasting sessions every time we would talk. We'll have hours on ends. So I thought, why don't we create a public catalog and capture some of these conversations? It was a very self-serving, very pure and simple reason and intentions. But then over time, I realized once again, full circle into the beginning of this conversations, hierarchy of ignorance. We're just 24 at the time. What do we know about this world?
Mm.
Like, what do we know? So we shifted the format to more interview based and we started having the people we deemed as interesting. Because even now, like my show has amounted to a certain accolades. I've hit a couple amazing milestones, which I'm very grateful for. But I still uphold this North Star, so to speak, or this compass from my podcasting where I want to do this in perpetuity. I want to do this for at least 10 years. I have 6.5 years more to go. So to do that, I have to stay in the game for as long as I can. And to stay the course, I have to do what I feel interesting intrinsically first.
Right, right.
Because intrinsic motivation goes a far away. I share that because I still want to have the people that I find interesting, not just what the analytics or what the listenership says. And I try to ask a few personal, selfish questions to fulfill my own selfish desires because I have to be engaged in these conversations. Like I reached out to you because I never heard about the deconversion process until I came across your podcast. I never heard about the term graceful atheist. It seems like a very oxymoron, right? Like
Oh yeah, it's
under this,
intentional.
yeah, under this societal propaganda, if you're an atheist, you can't be graceful. Grace is exclusive rights by the religions, etc., etc. So I generally have a lot of questions to ask you, which we'll experience next week.
Yes, yeah.
So I still uphold that same intention even now, miles away from where I started it. But at the end of the day, I want to elevate the stories that I think need to be elevated the most. And I want to have conversations and learn from some of the, not just the best or smart, but really interesting people. Because I think through these collective conversations, I'm hopefully imparting this message that we all share more similarities than not.
Yeah.
Because I think that is the key ingredient to hopefully one day moving through and resolving this extremely polarized, these deep chasmic divide between the left and the right, whatever language you want to divide. And I think a lot of that comes down to this lack of conversations. We are no longer having conversations as human beings face to face. It's just not happening. Different political ideologies, you're a murderer, you're etc.
Yeah,
Right? We
yeah.
just label them under as whatever boxes arbitrarily. And yeah, those are some of the intentions I still uphold. But it's honestly like therapeutic for me. I live for these conversations, like the SEO, the marketing, the other stuff. I hate those. It's just part of the process. But I love having these conversations, and it's almost like food for thought.
Yeah. Wow. A couple things I want to respond to that. One, again, to quote Jennifer Michael Hecht, she talks about how doubters and believers have more in common than the vast middle. The vast middle doesn't care. It hasn't thought about it, right? And the doubters and the true believers have thought about it a lot. And so I do appreciate this kind of conversation. I talked a lot about after I left Bible college, still Christian for many years afterwards, but I missed immediately the 2 a.m. conversations in the dining hall where whoever random person happened to be in there, you get into these deep, meaningful conversations. And I completely missed that. And so similar to you, like part of this is selfishly for me, so that I get to have these conversations because that is part of my mental health. That's something that I need is to have meaningful conversations, even with people with whom I disagree. And I think that I couldn't agree more that that is part of what is absolutely missing, that we don't talk to one another anymore and respect the humanity of each other and so on. So I appreciate you being on.
Yeah, you're 27 years of, I understand that you've been a Christian for
27
years before
yeah.
the conversion. And another, aside from dining hall, 2 a.m. conversations, some of the deepest conversations I've had is on the airplane. We
Mm.
call that the passenger seat confession, right? Because I will never see you again. So I'll just
Yes,
just
exactly.
be radically honest with you because I have this perceived safety net of never having crossed paths again. And of course, that's true of most, but I still remember some of the most interesting and deep, insightful conversations on the plane. And I think that speaks to, once again, to tie into full circle where we all have a lot to share. And I think as long as you can identify those people, because I do feel like on a societal level, I'm very deeply concerned about the rise of superficiality, rise of superficial conversations. I had this conversation with Dr. David Rudd. He's a former president at University of Memphis, tenured psychologist, top psychologist in the world. And he does talk about that even with his distinguished academic career and as a president of a large university, he does see this correlation with the rise of superficiality along with the rise of mental health issues.
Mm.
And I
Yeah.
think we have to actively combat that because it's only going to get worse. As short form content, as you saw on YouTube, everything just pushing out with the rise of TikTok. And I do really feel like deep, meaningful sociality or social relationships is often predicated and dependent on deep, meaningful, intentional conversations.
Mm. Benoit Kim, the podcast is Discover More. How can everyone find you? How can they find the podcast? How can they find out more about you?
I don't have any books to promote. So if you found any interest or any value in some of the conversations we had today with David, and yeah, this is just how I am in real life. And I love these conversations. And truly, nothing excites me more than when a listener reaches out or I can connect with you offline to ask more questions. Don't just follow me, ask me difficult questions, heavy hitter questions. That's how I keep my brain active because Alzheimer's is my biggest fear. A little quick disclosure, but if you found any interest, I invite you to join me on my Discover More journey on the podcast. Discover More, it's a play on words. Hopefully, you're discovering more value from the actual container of the episode that you tune in, but it's also more of a call to action that I invite you to and I challenge you to discover more about on your own accord that you found interested in. If your interest was piqued by anything we talked about today, do more discovering, do more researching on your own. That's critical thinking, thinking about thinking. So it's twofold about my name, and you can find me Apple Podcasts, Spotify, etc., etc. And if you're more of a visual learner, my in-person studio was recently completed with fully stacked media setup. So I invite you to check us out. Some of the cinematic effort we try to put into these videos more and more on YouTube at Discover More Podcast. And if you want to connect with me on social media, it's also Discover More Podcast. I drew the line at TikTok, so I don't have any TikTok presence.
I respect that. I respect that. Benoit Kim, thank you so much for being on the Graceful Atheist podcast.
Thank you for having me on, for your thoughtfulness and the thoughtful questions you shared.
Final thoughts on the episode. As Benoit said, it's as if he has lived 10 different lives. He has so much life experience at such a young age. It is quite impressive. Benoit's podcast, Discover More, is wide-ranging on all the various topics that he is interested in, and it has a particular focus on mental health. Because I'm me, and part of what this podcast is about is skepticism, I have to acknowledge here that both Benoit and his podcast veer into the areas that I would consider pseudoscience at times. At the same time, I think Benoit himself is dedicated to learning and discovering the truth. And I wouldn't have him on this podcast if I didn't believe that he has something important to say. Benoit's discussion of being in the policymaking field and acknowledging the compromises that one would have to make nearly on a daily basis, I thought was profound. His move towards clinical psychology and the desire to help people, as well as what he's doing with the podcast to normalize mental health and focusing on a growth mindset, I think are very, very important. And Benoit is uniquely qualified to speak on those issues. On the topic of psychedelics, if you're a long-term listener to this podcast, you'll know that I am super skeptical and at best ambivalent. The point that I made in the conversation that I have spent a fair amount of time with people on these various psychedelic drugs, as well as a number of other drugs. And the experience for the person subjectively is profound and deep and meaningful, and the experience for the sober person is not. Having said that, we also at this podcast believe in evidence, and there is very compelling evidence that in a clinical environment with trained clinicians, psychedelics can have a positive impact in certain areas. The reason I haven't talked on this subject until now is that many of the voices out there, including people like Sam Harris, I think are way too cavalier. And they are not talking about the potential downsides and risks and limitations. And Benoit was able to articulate those downsides, risks, and limitations while also being a proponent. And so I really appreciate the perspective that he brings and the research that he has done. But finally, I will say, be skeptical, do some of your own research. If this is an area that you feel like would be helpful for you, seek out professional help. Don't do this on your own. Finally, it's obvious that Benoit is a Christian, but I really appreciate that he was willing to come on this podcast. I am actually going to be on the Discover More podcast in a few months. And both of those conversations were really fun and helpful, and it was good communication. And I hope that Benoit and I can be examples of what it is like to speak with people who don't necessarily agree. We were able to find our common ground, what I call secular grace. I think Benoit is describing in a different way about caring for people, and that's really what matters. That's the core part that makes a difference. You can find the Discover More podcast wherever you find your podcasts, as well as on YouTube. Check out Benoit and the Discover More podcast. I want to thank Benoit for being on the podcast, for sharing his personal story, sharing his life philosophy, sharing his experience and expertise. Thank you so much, Benoit, for being on the podcast. The Secular Grace thought of the week is listen to people. My favorite quote from this conversation with Benoit is, people just want to be heard. And this is coming from a clinical psychologist, someone who professionally has been in counseling sessions, has done work with, in sometimes very extreme mental health issues. And this is something that I believe very, very deeply. This is what I think this podcast is about. And Benoit said this as well, that people feel like they are alone, that they're the only one experiencing whatever the thing is. And this is what this podcast has been about. To say you are not alone in your deconstruction, in your questions, in your doubts. So those of us who have gone through deconstruction, some of us who have gone through deconversion, and we're on the other side and we want to live a graceful life, we need to be willing to listen, to sit down and hear people. But more importantly, for the person with whom we are speaking, for them to feel heard. Not that we are just waiting to respond and correct, but that that person feels like we understand them. My deep feeling is that the human experience is the need to be known. And in some ways, we are trapped within our own minds subjectively. The more we communicate with other human beings and feel heard, feel known, the more whole as a human being we become. Next week, Arlene interviews Stephanie Stelvey. Stephanie is the amazing artist on Instagram at stephanie.stavley.artist. Her artwork is around family, being married, having children, sex, just the whole experience. It's absolutely beautiful. It's a long-running series that tells a long story. You're definitely not going to want to miss this next week. Until then, my name is David, and I am trying to be the Graceful Atheist. Join me and be graceful human beings. The beat is called Waves by Mackay Beats. If you want to get in touch with me to be a guest on the show, email me at gracefulatheist@gmail.com. For blog posts, quotes, recommendations, and full episode transcripts, head over to gracefulatheist.com. This is the Graceful Atheist Podcast. part of the Atheist United Studios podcast network.